Two men in fake police uniforms barged their way into John's house, pretending to be homeowner association enforcement. No permit, no reason, just overconfidence. John pressed the hidden alarm button. Seconds later, armed security stormed in. And that's when everything erupted. What happened next no one saw coming. But let's start from the origin. It started with a loud, aggressive knock at the front door. The kind that sends a shock through your chest and sets off alarm bells in your head. John Reynolds, a 38-year-old financial consultant, sat motionless in his home office, his fingers poised over his keyboard. He scowled and glanced at the security monitors mounted on the wall. Two men stood at the door, dressed in police uniforms. But something was off. The uniforms were creased, the stitching looked low quality, and the homeowner association patches on their shoulders were slightly tilted. Real cops didn't wear uniforms like that. Homeowner association enforcement. Open up, one of them barked, his tone sharp and demanding. John's brow tightened. Homeowner association rules were strict, sure, but he'd broken none of them. And even if he had, homeowner association enforcers didn't usually show up unannounced, dressed like cops, pounding on doors like they were executing a raid. Something wasn't right. Slowly, he stood and approached the door. Careful not to make a sound, he opened it just a sliver, enough to see the men more clearly. "We need to inspect the property," the shorter one said. His voice, flat and cold, his dark eyes, empty of emotion, scanned John like he was prey. "Complaint about what?" John kept his hand on the lock, muscles tightening. "Don't make this difficult," the taller one replied. He was broader, with a hard face and a gash running down the side of his jaw. He shoved the door open with his shoulder and stepped inside before John could react. John's pulse skyrocketed. His gut screamed at him to stop this, to push back. But the shorter man followed, closing the door behind him with a slow, deliberate snap. "Where's your warrant?" John's voice hardened as he stepped back. "We don't need one," the tall one sneered. "Homeowner Association authority." Homeowner Association didn't have that kind of power. John's gaze swept toward the kitchen. The shorter man was already moving, running his fingers along the marble countertop like he was shopping for furniture. He picked up a set of car keys from the dish near the sink, twirling them around his finger. "Nice place," the shorter one said, his mouth curling into a sly smile. "How much you make, John?" John's mind raced. They were too calm, too comfortable. This wasn't about a complaint, this was a setup, a racket. His eyes flicked toward the security panel near the kitchen island. His finger hovered over the silent alarm button. His heart pounded as he considered his options. The shorter man's gaze intensified. Not going to answer. John pressed the button. The panel's light blinked red, his pulse steadied. "Let's see how much you're really worth," the tall one said, his voice low and menacing. John didn't say a word. He just stood there watching, waiting as tension crackled in the air, because now the timer was ticking. "Who the hell do you think you are?" John's voice cut through the tension like a blade. His eyes narrowed as the two fake homeowner association officers rifled through his home without a trace of hesitation or fear. His heart hammered against his ribcage, adrenaline rushing through his veins. This wasn't a routine inspection. It was a breach, an intrusion. The taller one didn't even blink. He pulled out a laminated badge that looked like it had been printed on a home office printer. The edges were worn, the seals slightly blurred. He held it up like it meant something. "We've had reports about illegal modifications," the taller one said, his voice a little too casual for someone breaking the law. "That's," John spat, his fists curled. At his sides, his chest rose and fell with tight, controlled breaths as he fought the urge to knock the cocky look off the man's face. The shorter one opened a drawer near the kitchen island. His hand slipped inside, and John's muscles tensed. The sound of metal keys jingling as they were pulled free made his blood pressure surge. The man tossed John's car keys into the air and caught them with a grin. "Nice car, John. Mind if we take a look?" His voice was taunting, the grin on his face sharp and threatening. John's jaw locked so hard it ached, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His instinct screamed at him to act, to strike, but he forced himself to stay still. "Not yet." "Get the hell out of my house," John growled, his tone low and deadly. The tall one chuckled, stepping toward him with calculated arrogance. He was bigger than John by a few inches, broader in the shoulders. His smile widened, teeth flashing. Or what? John's pulse spiked. His gaze flicked toward the shorter man's hand as it slid toward his waistband. A gun? A knife? His breath stalled. His muscles coiled like a spring. His mind calculated a dozen scenarios, none of them good. Then heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, fast measured. A wave of cold control swept through John's chest. 3 men in black tactical gear surged into the room, rifles raised and leveled. "Drop your weapons. Hands on your head." The room exploded into chaos. The shorter man's hand froze inches from his waistband. The taller one's mouth opened in shock as the butt of a rifle was pressed against his chest, forcing him to the floor. John's security team moved with brutal accuracy. The shorter man hit the hardwood with a grunt. His cheek pressed against the floor. The taller one was pinned a second later, a knee digging into his backbone. "What the hell is this?" The taller one growled, his voice strained, his face contorted with a mixture of anger and disbelief. As his wrists were yanked behind his back, John stepped forward, his shadow falling over the 2 men as they struggled under the weight of his security team. His expression was ice cold. "Private security," John said evenly. He crouched down, lowering his face to meet the taller man's furious glare. "And you two are intruding." The shorter man's breathing hitched. His eyes darted toward the rifles trained on them. The confidence that had been there minutes ago was gone, replaced by cold, hard fear. John smiled faintly. His pulse had steadied. Control was back in his hands. And these 2 fools, they had no idea how badly they had just messed up. As the fake cops were zip-tied and disarmed, John's head of security, Marcus Kelly, a muscular man with a calm, deadly presence, crouched beside the taller man. "Who sent you?" Marcus growled. "No one." The man spat. Marcus twisted the man's arm until he groaned in pain. "Don't lie. Some guy paid us to come check things out," the shorter one said, his voice shaking. John said, standing over them, "You're thieves. You were going to rob me?" The taller one's eyes hardened. "Lawyers will have you eating out of a gutter for this." John's expression darkened. "You think so?" Marcus held up a small hidden camera retrieved from one of their lapels. A red light flashed. "They were recording," Marcus said. John smirked. "Thanks for the proof." The shorter one's face paled. "Do you know how many years impersonating an officer carries?" John's smile was ice cold. "I'm sure the judge will be delighted." The police arrived 10 minutes later. The fake homeowner association officers were hauled off in handcuffs. You were right," one of the officers said to John. "They've got a record. Robbery, home invasion. These guys have been at it for months." John leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "I figured." The taller one locked eyes with John as he was shoved into the squad car. "This isn't over," he growled. John smiled. "Yes, it is." The door slammed shut. The cruiser pulled away. Marcus walked over, adjusting the strap of his tactical vest. "You all right?" John exhaled. "Yeah, just another day in paradise." Marcus nodded. "We'll tighten security." "Good idea." John stepped back into his house, locking the door behind him. He glanced at the damage the intruders had caused, opened drawers, scattered papers, then walked to the security panel and reset the alarm. As the system beeped, John smiled to himself. "Try that again, I dare you."